He has appeared in Broadway's Of Mice and Men. He is currently in this show on AMC called Feed the Beast, and you probably know him as Corrections Officer O'Neill from Orange is the New Black. Please give it up for Joel Marsh Garland.
I have a broken rib today and a broken pinky toe, so you'll forgive me. I came out, I'm a little wounded. And my story is not funny. There's been a lot of really funny people up here tonight, but when Robin asked me to do this, I didn't pay attention to the fact that it was about childhood. And I had a fractured childhood. Like, my memories of childhood are really difficult to put back together because it was challenging. You know, my family broke apart when I was quite young, and I don't think that's unusual. But my father was a crazy person. So you know that part of relationships where you meet new people and you sort of share your war stories, where you're like, this happened to me when I was little, or this happened the other day. And so my war story is about my childhood. If I want to talk to somebody longer, I'll be like, well, this is the time that, I lost all my toys because the stripper that we used to live with, sold them. Or oh yeah, that's the time we were homeless during Hurricane Gloria, and I watched 100-year-old trees float away in the wind. Or the story about when the trailer burned down. So if I like you, those are the stories I'll tell you, because those stories, as I remember them, invite you to talk to me longer. And if I don't like you, I'll tell you a story about the time that I was kidnapped, which is the story I'm going to tell you tonight. So when I was 7, I'll tell you the story as I remember it, and it's going to be a little longer than that, but as I remember it, when I was 7, my parents had a joint custody. We'd spend the first couple of days of the week with my father, the second couple of days of the week with my mother, and they'd alternate weekends. They were both in college, and they were both doing night jobs. So it was a Wednesday. We had switched in the middle of the week. My sister and I was 7, she was 5. And I remember being at my mother's house, and I remember my father trying to break the door down at my mother's house, and he broke the lock and got the door open, and then the little chain lock was still there, and I remember my mother and my stepfather holding the door closed. And I think they called the police. And then I remember we snuck out the back way and we went to get into the car. And I remember my father had come in another car, a big green car, which I believe was his sister's car. And he ran to the car that we were trying to get into, and he pulled me out of that car, and he put me in his car. And then the next thing I remember, we had gone back to where he lived on Hope Street, and we had a cat. We hadn't had a cat before, so we had a new cat, and it was a white and orange cat. And my father said he had found the cat at the trash-to-energy plant where he lived, where he worked in the evenings. And when he found it, it was a black cat, but they washed it 3 or 4 times, and it turned out it was an orange and white cat. And most of our furniture in this place came from the trash-to-energy plant. We had a fold-out, what passed for a futon at the time, that had been somebody else's trash, and we had some cups and other things that were that. So we were pretty poor. And that's how I remember the story. I remember my father came and got me and kidnapped me, and then we got a cat. So as I got older, I thought, well, this story is not complete. And I talked to my mother. My mother was traumatized by her double traumatized by her childhood and traumatized by my childhood. She wouldn't talk about it for a long time, and she went to a monastery and meditated for 3 years. And somewhere in that time, I got her to open up. And so I said, Mom, can you fill in the details of that story? And she said, okay, when you were little and we had the joint custody, you came over to my house on a Wednesday. And I said, how was it at your father's? And you said, well, it was fine, but Dad left us alone last night while he went to work. And my mother was pissed because he left a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old alone overnight for hours and hours and hours. So she called my father, and she said, Steve, what are you doing? You can't have the kids back until we make sure you have coverage in the evenings. And so technically, that might be when my mother kidnapped me. So my father doesn't answer her. He doesn't hang up the phone. He gets in a car, drives 2 miles, and breaks down the door. And then my mother said, so they held him at the door. He left. They called the cops. They went to take us out the back way. We get to the car. All that happened the same way I remember it. We get in the car. He pulls me out of the car. My sister runs across the street. My grandmother lived in the same housing projects. We lived in a housing project in Windham, Connecticut. And my sister ran across the street to get help from my grandmother. My uncle comes from my grandmother's place. My mother's at the car. She's pulling my father's hair. She's trying to stop him from driving away. My uncle runs over. He grabs the keys out of the ignition. He throws them into the grass so nobody can take off. The cops arrive. The cops says, my father's primary parent, my mother's secondary parent, because the way it was figured out in the court. So the cops decide that I'm going to go home with my father, and my sister's going to stay with my mother. And that's how the story ends, according to my mom. So I thought, that's a pretty bad story to tell in front of a bunch of people. So I remembered my Uncle Dan's version of the story. And my Uncle Dan's version of the story is that this is the time that he dated a Spanish woman. So, no, we did not live in Spain. We lived in housing projects in Windham, Connecticut. And most of the people there were Puerto Rican. So this is really the time my uncle dated a Puerto Rican woman, but he thinks that she was a Spanish woman. So he did date a woman who spoke Spanish, but he didn't date a woman who was Spanish. Now, in this story, my Uncle Dan is doing karate. He's shirtless. He's in his house. He's in my grandmother's apartment, and he is practicing karate. And my sister comes running and screaming, and my uncle comes out, and he looks across the way, and there's a green car, and my mother's there pulling my father's hair, and he assesses the situation. He runs over, pulls the keys out of the ignition, and throws them, and a crowd appears around the event. And out of the crowd, this beautiful Spanish woman looks over and sees my Uncle Dan and thinks he must be cold. He's been shirtless and doing karate. So she loans him a jacket, her brother's jacket. And when he goes to return the jacket, the beautiful Spanish woman is there, and they date for some time. That's my Uncle Dan's version of the story. And so last week, my mother and my sister came down, and I said, look, I'm going to tell this horrible story about my childhood, about our childhood, our lives. I'm really sorry about that. You guys will be embarrassed. I tell the story, and my mother repeats the parts of the story she knew. And, you know, my mother's memory of my childhood and her raising me and my sister during the times that she did was about, like, watching the Muppets and popping popcorn in a walk and telling us stories. It's really sweet. And my sister remembers the same story, the same things that happened. And my sister's trail of events is my father broke down the door. We tried to hide out the back way. We go to the car, and my sister runs away. And she runs over to get help from my grandmother. My uncle comes and helps. And I get taken away. And my sister and I were the only constants in each other's lives. Like, the parents were divorced. There was a lot of movement back and forth. But up until that time, when we were 5 and 7, we weren't separated. And I was taken away, and she was alone, and she spent the next 2 weeks. She thinks it was 2 weeks, but I know that I was in Maine for a month. So I know that it was a month that my mother and my stepfather would take long car trips because they were worried about where my father was and that he would come and try to take my sister. And she just remembered 2 weeks of missing me and driving around Connecticut for extended periods with the hope that my father wouldn't show up. And I was like, well, that's tremendously sad, Kimberly. That's a terrible story. And she said, well, at the end of it, my mother's sister, Melissa, and she knew that we were going to get back together, that I'd see my sister again. And Melissa said, well, I think the best way for you to see your brother is to dress up like a Vulcan. So my sister thought this is a great idea. And so my aunt got her some little pointy ears, and she got her the little Star Trek badge to go on her chest and a blue shirt, and she slicked back her hair. And my sister dressed up as an alien. And she came and saw me after what she thought was 2 weeks, but it was really a month. And she told me that 2 weeks ago, and it broke my heart because I couldn't remember. Like, that was the one thing, that's the one version of the story that I wish I remembered. But that's my story.
Comes the world